Hi, I'm Matt Moran, and I'm with Arrogance Age Media. I'm a consultant, I'm also a songwriter, and I do a variety of other things. This is going to be one of my geekier tutorials. I have a variety of those, including some stuff on Excel automation. So what I do professionally, for the most part, and just some writing and some other things, is I do automation for clients. And so this is going to be a video where I show how to use Google Sheets email templating system, but also how I'm taking Airtable data, which is a relational database kind of in the form of spreadsheets. If people go and look back on a prior channel, I explain how to pull data out of that and turn it into data in Google's BigQuery cloud infrastructure, and ultimately use Google Data Studio to create a dashboard. This is a dashboard that exists in Google Sheets for a client, and this is how we send out weekly updates to every salesperson in the company to just kind of remind them of their numbers, show them their goals and their actuals, maybe spread them on to higher sales. So let's jump into that. We'll look at the data, and then I'll come back and I'll have a little concluding remarks. Okay, so the objective, this is a report, a dashboard that my client uses. Now, I've modified a bunch of the data. They have so much proprietary data, I can't really show that. So we've kind of fudged the names up here and the client names, and some of the section titles are different, but either way, this is a reasonable facsimile of the report. And the way this report operates is at the start of every month, I've created a system that generates this sheet based on active clients, based on active salespeople. It generates the sheet, and the sheet actually extends fairly far to the right. Maybe I'm only showing 4 salespeople. There might be, 16, 17, 18 on any given month. And then the managers go in and they fill in the goals for those salespeople. So it's meant to track goals, sales goals, and the actuals against those sales. And then what so my system does is it goes out and it grabs the data from Airtable. And if you want to know more about how to do that, I have a prior video where I go through extensively grabbing data from Airtable and ultimately moving it into Google Data Studio. But I have the code that allows you to grab whatever data you want out of Airtable and put it into a Google Sheet. And so that's what we're doing here. So it goes out and grabs the data a couple times a day, and it fills in the actuals. So we don't touch the goals, we don't have to touch any of the formulas, but the system goes through multiple times a day and fills in the actuals to ensure that the report is as up to date as it needs to be. Also, a manager can force that to happen anytime they want, and just have the sheet updated. It only takes a few seconds. So that's kind of the dashboard. Now, every week we send reports from this dashboard to all the salespeople who have either goals or actual sales numbers. And what that report looks like is like this. So for any given salesperson, it's going to send them their online sales, their phone sales, if they have any. In this case, she does not have any. The total sales, and away we go, right? So that's for each salesperson. So I have another email client open. This is for another one of the salespeople on that team. And so I'm going to show you how to work with the HTML templating system and also with the worksheet data to generate this report, and a number of helper functions that I use. These functions get used throughout my application, which actually generates the actuals data and also creates the sheet on the fly. So some of these helper functions that I use to what we'll use the term map the spreadsheet and the data get used over and over again. I've included some of those, so if you look in the description, I'll mention this again if I haven't already mentioned it, because I'm piecing this video together from multiple sections. There will be a link to my website, and you can grab the data, and actually I'll have a copy of this sheet available with the data inside of it that you can then play around with. So what it's going to do is it's going to go through, and really in effect for every salesperson, it's going to grab these data elements and bring them to the templating system. So it's going to grab the data. Now it only grabs data that has non-zero values. So for instance, if they have a goal set but no sales, it's still going to return that data. And if they have some sales where they didn't have goals, they just got sales outside of their goals objectives, it's going to return that as well. So it'll return that, but it won't return any zero data elements. So for instance, with Amy, we see here that she has a goal for Brainiac Software, but no sales, and she has sales for Johnson Manufacturing, no goal. But in the second section for phone sales, that's for online sales, for phone sales, she has no values. So phone sales will return zero data in this instance. And then totals, of course, will match the cumulative. In her case, it will only match the online sales. But we can see in the case of, for instance, George Bronson, he has some information in the online sales and some information in the phone sales. So the totals will reflect both of those. So what that will look like once again is, here's Amy's. She has online sales. She has no phone sales. And the total sales will basically match. All right, so how do we do that? Well, the first thing is, and what should be understood is, I've actually written plenty of systems, both in Microsoft Excel and in Google Sheets, that go out and it actually iterates through the sheet to grab data and pick up data and set data and all that stuff. And if you were to watch the code operate, you'd actually see it moving through the sheet. But the reality is that's extraordinarily inefficient. The most efficient way to work with things is actually just have all the data in arrays and objects that you can then operate with. So what you're going to see in my code is that I grab all the data of the sheet, excuse me, I grab all the data of the sheet and return it to an array using the get display values, and we'll look at that. And then once I do that, I never touch the sheet again because I'm not writing any data back. This is simply a reporting system. So I grab the data once and then I act on the data that I've grabbed because it's significantly faster. So let's take a look at that. We'll jump into my code and I'll kind of explain what happens here. And in order to make that happen, I do a series of mapping functions. And the mapping functions let me know my place in the data. And so I'll explain what I mean, but I'm going to map where these salespeople are, basically the column that they exist at. So for Amy, that's column F is where her data really starts. And that's all I really need is the starting point, which is column 6, and George is column 10, and Larry is column 14 and 18, so away we go. Then I also map the sections here, the rows, and what I'm really going to be mapping will be where, well, first of all, I'll map the clients I have, so the number of clients and their ordinal position of where they live. ABC Company is 1, Brainiac Software is 2, Johnson Manufacturing is 3, but then I'll also map separately into an object the starting point for online sales, where the totals of online sales are, the starting point for phone sales, the first place that there's client data, and the totals, and the starting point for the grand totals and the total grand total line. And then I also return this last update because I use that later. I don't use it in this particular function, but I do use those elements when I'm creating the sheet to place formulas where they need to be, and also when I'm setting the actuals. In this case, I'll really only be using the starting point and the client information plus the column information from the salespeople. The other thing I do is I will be grabbing from this staff list the also the same kind of this matching key values in another object that will have the salesperson name and their email address. And we'll use that because that's how we're going to know where to send the emails. Once again, I fudged this a little bit, but in my prior video, I do show how to grab that data out of Airtable because this is all coming from Airtable and it has a record ID and all that fun stuff. So let's kind of jump into it. So I'm not going to write the code in front of you. It seems like a waste of time. So what I'm going to do is just walk you through what's happening with this code. So the first thing is I get the sheet name. Now, this is hard-coded, but I actually have a function that's used in their application because we do a variety of sheets based on very similar information. So the year, the month, and then what kind of sheet it is. So normally if I'm doing this sheet, I pass to it the report value, and it will return this sheet name. It creates it on the fly. But if I pass to it data, that's when I'm grabbing a data sheet and I want them all to have uniform names. And if I pass pivot, it would return the pivot tables that I used to ultimately grab the actuals data. But once again, I'm going to hard code it here just for sake of simplicity. And what I do is I get the sheet name, and then I create an object of the sheet itself using the spreadsheet app, get active, get sheet by name. I pass to it the goal sheet name that we've created here. And the next thing I do, and this is the only time I'm going to grab data or touch the sheet in any actuality, I'm going to grab the sheet values using the get data range, get display values. Get data range is going to return all the data in my sheet. And so what it's going to do is it's going to go from A1 down to the last row with data, where this last update is. And it's going to return this as an array of arrays. Basically, each row is its own array. So element 0 would be this row, element 1 would be this row, and so forth. Once I have that data, this is all I'm going to work with now to pull out the totals and do everything I need. And so the first thing I do is I map these client columns, and I do that based on, or I grab an array of the first column, because that's going to return, what I want to return is this, because I'm going to work with that. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to pass that column of data to this map clients function, and that's going to return two objects for me. It's going to return my client map and my section map. So I'll explain what those are. The client map, once again, is only going to be a listing of the clients and their ordinal position. So ABC Company 1, Brainiac Software 2, 3, 4, up to 6. And I don't need to do that for each section. I just need it one time to know where it is. But then the other thing I do, this section map, actually returns a series of key sections in my sheet. It's going to return the starting point for online sales, which will be row 5 in this case. And my client actually has about 30 clients and they have about 16, 17 salespeople, but it'll work for this functionally to show us how this is operating. So it's going to return wherever the starting point is for online sales. Now that's always at 5 actually, but if we change something elsewhere in the sheet, it would find it and it would ultimately provide what we need. But either way, this is dynamic because if there are more salespeople up here or more clients up here, it's going to push those down and this gets pushed down. So once the sheet's created, I use these mapping functions and I return the starting point for online sales, the total point, the starting point for phone sales, the total point, and starting point for the grand totals and the total line. And once again, I return that. So we're going to see that happen. Then what I do is I also map the staff, and that's going to return so what I'm doing there is I'm taking the first row, and when I say I'm mapping the staff, it's the salespeople. So I'm going to grab the first row, and then I'm going to return the column numbers. So the key will be the name of the salesperson, and the value will be the column number. And then I actually grab the same thing, another object where I have the key being the salesperson name and the value being the email address. And we'll cross-reference those things to be able to send to the appropriate email address. And then here we have a number of those markers that are critical. I don't need the total line, so I just grab the starting line for online start. We'll see how that happens. Phone start, total. So those are the sections in the sheet that I need to know to be able to grab the data. It's going to be row 5, row 17, row 29 in this case. And then I grab the count of the clients. Then what we do is we're going to run through each staff person that we mapped from the sheet. And for each person, I deconstruct this to have their sales name and sales column. And then I use this sales name to retrieve the email address from the other object we've created up here. Once I do that, I go and I get the totals by section. So I pass to it the sheet values. So we're not passing the sheet, we're just passing the sheet values itself. The column I need to work with the starting column, because if we're working with a given salesperson, as we iterate through, the first time through, that sales column is going to be equal to Amy's sales column. So let's look right here. Right? That'll be first time through, the next time George, the next time Larry, the next time Rachel. All right. And I passed with the sales column, the count of clients, we need to know that. And then each starting position, and we'll look at that code in just a second. Then I go through, and if there is any totals data, so if there was no data for that salesperson, it's not going to send them a report. But if there is any data, which I only have to evaluate the total, because if there's either data in online or in phone, one or the other, there's going to be totals data. So that's what I'm evaluating. So if there is totals data, then great, I set some values. The report date, the report name, which includes the salesperson's name that we derived up here. I then grab the template file, which we're going to take a look at, this goal totals, and then I pass to it the report date, the report name, the salesperson's name, and then the data elements we've returned from getting those totals by section. Finally, we create the email message HTML. We evaluate that so it runs the code and ultimately generates our HTML email. And this logger is just throwing out the salesperson and their email address. We don't really need it, but I'm leaving it here to show what's going on. And then finally, we use the mail app to send our email message from the reporting system to the email address in question, and the subject is the report name. Okay, so what I'm going to do is set a couple breakpoints. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is show you this, because as I'm working with this, I don't always want to be checking my emails to see how everything is working. And so I'll often include this where I just create a little sidebar that we can look at and we can see effectively what's coming through. And so I'll set a breakpoint right here, save that. And so I only need to do this one time. I just want to take a look at it and see what's happening. So we'll hit debug. It goes through, and now we're here. We'll evaluate this stuff a little bit later on. But now, when it processes this line, it should give me a dialog box that has my HTML output, the email message I'm going to be sending. And it should show it right here in the sheet. So let's go into that. Here it is. Here's our numbers for Amy Bartz, Brainiac Software, Johnson Manufacturing, which we can kind of see right here, right there behind us. And no phone sales, so there's nothing here in her column, and totals. So that's kind of the email that's going to be generated. Now we're going to stop the code. We don't really need to show that. I just wanted you to see I use that to, when I'm working through the code, I don't necessarily want to send emails every time and then check my email to see if what's working is doing what I want it to do. So let's set a couple key breakpoints so we can take a look at things. Let's set a breakpoint right here. And we'll go into this. We're going to just let it go into this function one time. So I want to go in there and take a look at it and kind of deconstruct where it grabs all the data from the sheet data. But I'm going to stop it here so we can look at what's happened up here and evaluate this stuff. And then we'll stop it right here when we process through this. So I'm going to go into this function and set a breakpoint right there. Okay. That should give us plenty of places to stop and kind of analyze what's going on. And then ultimately we're going to take a look. Well, actually, we'll take a look at that now. This is the HTML template, so I show you where we pass the data to it. Let's take a look at that template. So here's the template, and here are the variables that I'm pulling from, sending to it from the code. The report name, which we use twice in the title, and then we have an H1 tag. The name of the person, it could be name or company, because I can actually use this to return this data as well. I just have to pass to it a different column number, and I do that. I get sent to management every week, but this is just for the staff people. I pass to it the report date, and then I know I'm going to process 3 sections, and so I create this array called section title for online, phone, and totals. I set a blank array, which is ultimately going to hold our data, so we only have to reference one data element as we go through this. So I set that just undefined at this point. And then I go through each section title, and I send to it the section title, and the index. The index is simply used for this. The first time through, I set the number data to online data, because number data is what we're going to use down here to evaluate our information, right? So number data is equal to the online data initially, then it's equal to the phone data the second time through, and finally it's equal to the total data. And that's how we're going to process this. Right here, we put the section name, sales, right? So online sales, phone sales, total sales. And once again, this is going to correspond with what we get returned. Online sales, phone sales, total sales. Okay? Now, if the number data length is 0, then I'm just going to put this little message there. And it's going to be red. It says no records in this section. Otherwise, it's going to process the table. So once again, we see that right here. There were no phone sales for Amy Bartz, and so this section reflects that. And so once there is data, we create a table. And I set it at 70%. The reason I do that is when you're looking at an email like this, when it's full width, it's just kind of ugly looking. It's too stretched out for the data that we have, so I made it slightly smaller. You can play around with that. And then I go in here and we set our titles. So the titles are client, goal, actuals, and none of that is particularly dynamic. It's just all hard-coded. Then we get into our actual section. I set a few variables that I'm going to use for the total section. And then I go through each data element in the data that we passed to it. So remember, number data for each iteration through is changed from online data, the phone data, and the total data that we pass to it. And so if there's, so I'm going to iterate through that, and I pass to it the data itself, and then the index. The index is simply used to change the color of the rows so that we can have, indicate once there are multiple rows of data, that it just is a little bit easier to read and follow. So I set these values, which I'll use later, and then I'm basically referencing, and notice here that I'm referencing the data elements 1 and 2, not element 0, because as we return that data, we'll look at it. I return the client name as data element 0, and then data 1 is the goal, and data element 2 is the actuals, and so we iterate those up and add them. And then I place the actual values on the sheet. So first column will be the client name. This is the actual, this is the goals, this is the actual, this is the plus minus, and this is the percentage. And then at the end, we do some calculations so that we can then on the footer place our totals. And that's it. It's going to iterate through. So that's going to be that's the goal total HTML. Now, once again, you have access to a sheet where I've included this code and this kind of dummy report that you can then work with. And you can then play around with it and modify the code as you see fit. All right, so let's go through it. Let's take a look at what's happening. So we hit our first debug point, and now we can take a look at what we've done up here. Okay, so the first thing we did is we got the goal sheet. There it is, the name. And then we actually reference the actual goal sheet, which is right here. This is a sheet object. It has all kinds of methods and functions and information you can pull from it. And then we grab the sheet values. And this is the important part. So here's our sheet values. It's an array that's 38 items long, but it's an array of arrays. 38 items matches the number of rows. So we're at row 38 here. And the first element would be the first row. So goals versus actual, client totals. There's Amy, George, Larry, Grimes. And because these are merged cells, the cells after them that are part of that merge have no data in them. So that's corresponding with this right here. So the first element is the goals versus actual. Then the client totals which is actually column B. So column C, D, E has nothing. Then there's column F, right? So that's what we see here. So that's the first row of the sheet values. Then I grabbed the client column because I just wanted to work with that client data, and that's right here. And that's the column going down here with the client names and the total labels and all that stuff. So I grabbed that. That's what that is. Next thing we did is we went to this map clients and we returned the client map and the section map. So let's look at what's in the client map. Client map just has the client names one time. I didn't need to do it multiple times, of course, and their ordinal position. So ABC Company is 1, Brainiac Software 2, all the way down to Salamander Software being 6. So it's just returned that. And then it also returns this section map. The section map is really important for me laying data down. So the section map is very specific to my client's application. It's where the online records start, which in this case is row 5, the online totals on 12, the phone start is on 17, phone totals on 24, grand totals on 29, grand total start is on 29, grand totals on 35, and last update on 38. So once again, it's just matching with starting point 5, 12, 17, 24, 29, 35, and 38. Now I'm going to use that with that data. And now we're going to show the mapping of the staff and what that gets. That's just where we have the name of the salesperson and the column that they're on, right? And that pretty well maps our entire sheet for us. With that, I can pull data as needed from anywhere for a given salesperson, or theoretically a given client if I wanted to. And then the sales email is another object where we have salesperson's name and the email address. You can see I've dummied all these up to be my emails, or emails that ultimately route to me. And then I grabbed the starting point because we need all that stuff from the section map that we had created. I don't need the totals, but I do use those totals in other functions. For instance, when I'm creating the sheet, I use those to place the formulas where they need to be and correctly map the formulas. And that's a whole nother process. We might do a video about that, but I have to really then create a Airtable sheet that matches this and dummy all the data. So we may or may not get to it, but either way, that's what that does. And so I use that in other elements. Also, when I'm placing the actuals, I use the same mapping function so I know how to place these actuals. All right. Oh, important, these actuals run multiple times a day. The first thing it does, and we're not looking at this, is it zeroes out all the actuals. Because, for instance, if there was incorrect data entered, we don't just want to place new actuals down. We have to make sure that we zero anything out and only place the actual actuals from the system. But either way, another process. So we've got all those elements that give us our starting points, and here they are. And then we return the client count just by looking at the client map and count the length of the keys. So that gives us the client count. With that, we're going to be able to do virtually everything and get the data we need. All right, so then what we're going to do is we're going to go through each staff person, and for each sales rep entry, right, we deconstruct that into the salesperson name and their column. Now I could reference it without that, just using the entry and staff maps, but this is a little easier to read. So let's look at what happens there. Let's walk into it. So now we have the sales name is Amy Bartz. The sales column is 6, corresponding with Amy and this column. Next thing, we're going to take the sales name that we grabbed here, Amy Bartz. We're going to pass it to this object, the sales email object we created up here, which is here, and it should return us that email address. And it does. There we see it. And now we're going to go in and grab this data. And we're only going to go through this briefly, then I'll just let it run. But let's step into this function. Well, let me scroll down here so we can see what's going on. So first is I'm going to create some containers for the actual figures, just arrays that we're going to return of the online numbers, the phone numbers, and the grand total numbers. And here's how this is done. So we'll just walk through those. I could have just forwarded on to that breakpoint, but either way. So now we're going to go through this for every client. We're just going to go through for each client that we have. And we're going to look at each row for each section, because we've passed to it where all the sections start. So what happens here is we're looking at the goal sheet data. So once again, remember, we're not looking at the sheet. We are looking at the goal sheet data because that is faster for us to work with. And we have an online start. So we're going to look at the online start -1 because I'm actually grabbing their starting column. But actually, from an array standpoint, the ordinal position starts at 0, but the actual column or the actual row numbers start on the row numbers themselves. And I want that information. So the online start, where is it? Oh, right here. It's 5. So 5 minus 1 plus I, which is equal to 0 the first time. So that's going to be in the array element 5, start column -1, because once again I return the actual columns, but ordinal position within the array is going to be -1. Now what I'm looking for is there any data? That's right. So if we're looking at online start -1, that's going to be element number 4. Start column 6, so column 5 in our array, or element 5 in that array. And I'm going to check to see if it's greater than 0, because remember, I only want to return values. And so the first one we're going to be looking at, I'm positive, is ABC Company. We'll check that. And we're going to be looking at columns 5 and 6 to see if these are greater than 0. Now we can see they should come back to 0 and it shouldn't find any data there. That's okay. And we're not going to find data in the next section, and we're not going to find data in the next section for Amy. But we will find it on Brainiac software. So we're going to watch that happen. If we look at the data, remember, let's go back to online start, starting column 6. So element number 4, column 5, and column 6 is what we're going to look at. So element number 4, it's ABC Company. Column 5 and column 6 are both equal to 0. That tells us that there's no data there to return for this item. So it's not going to process this, because if it's greater than 0, it's going to then add this information into our data ultimately. Okay? So it should just bypass that. And it does. It bypasses that, and of course there's no total data. Now we're iterating through the second time. Well, let's watch this happen. So now we're here, and our online start is still 5, of course, but it's online start -1, so 4, plus I, which is now 1, so back to 5. So element 5 in the array, row 5 in that array. So now we're going to be looking actually at row 6, which is the equivalent of element number 5 in the array. And we're at the same starting column -1. So let's take a look. So it's going to be element 5, because online start is 5 minus 1 plus I, which is 1, so it's 5. So let's look at that. Brainiac software. Now as we scroll down to column 5, we see that there's a 1, and this is really our goals right here. This is our actuals. This is the plus minus, that's the percentage. So this is what we're seeing, is this row right here. That's what we're evaluating at this exact moment. So it's going to find data in online data, and it's going to process it to create an array to add into our values. So what is it doing there? I just create a value which is going to have the goal sheet online start -1 plus I, column 0. That's going to return column 0 is going to return our client name. And then it adds to that, it does the spread operator. And let me kind of drag this to the right here. And we're going to use the slice function. So we're going to first start on same row, online start, slice starting at the starting column -1, which is where the array element will be, and the starting column +3, which really in the array standpoint is going to, remember with slice, we look past the ending element that we want. So it's really kind of saying, get this, and slice references this, but it just grabs the data that's from here to just before the last element we reference in slice. So let's look at what happens there. And we'll see what happens to our string data here. Still undefined. Let's let it define itself. There it is. Now it's an array of 5 elements. Brainiac software, the goal number of 1, the actual of 0, the plus minus of -1, and the percentage. That is what we've grabbed right here. So I just wanted you to see how that happens. We don't need to go through this line by line for every single thing, but that's what's happening there. I don't think there's anything in the phone data for Brainiac. No, there isn't, so it'll bypass that. It will find something in the totals, because there is something in the totals. So it creates that element. And what it's effectively doing is building these items. So now we see that the online numbers has an array of the arrays, Brainiac software. Totals does as well. Phone number still has nothing in it. And looking at her code, will it? It will when we're done. It will have Johnson Manufacturing. So what we can do is, because we have a stop point here, is we can just reference through and until we see that there is some data for phone data. So let's just let it roll through this. Do we have anything under that? Phone numbers? No. Now we see the phone data finally has some elements in it, and let's take a look at it. That's our Martins and Sons, where we have a goal of 2 and actual of 0. So Martin and Sons, goal of 2, actual 0. So we've returned that. So let's just move out of this. I'm going to get rid of that breakpoint. And now we're, let's get out of this too. We don't need that. Get back into our function. So what it's done is now processed the rest of this. So let's go back through and see. So once again, once it grabbed that data, it just went through and added those elements into our HTML template and then sent those emails out to all those individuals. And that's what produces, for instance, this report. So if I go back to my email, I'm going to see there's the new one that came through. It's the same data, but let's make a change to the data so we can see what happens here. So if I just dummy this up and I go, okay, let's do something for phone sales for Amy. And I say she has a goal of 2 here, and the actuals came through as 3, and then she has a no goal here, but she has an actual of 1. Then we should get some additional information. So let's just run the process again. And we're just going to look at Amy's data. Oops, let's look at this one here. Now we see that Amy has online sales, she has some phone information, and the totals reflect all that. All right, so you can grab that code, you can play with it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Any suggestions? I know there are some places where I can minimize the number of lines, but sometimes I like the clarity of being able to see what's going on so I can follow my code, or if somebody else has to look at it. But that's how you can use spreadsheet data, mapping your spreadsheet, and ultimately create a pretty robust reporting system from Airtable data.
Okay, so you can see this is a pretty functional tool and a series of technologies on how I map the spreadsheet, specifically how I work with the data of the spreadsheet, not the spreadsheet itself, because it's so much faster, and then how I use the templating system to send out those emails to my clients, or to the salespeople for my client. Now, maybe this wasn't your cup of tea, maybe it's super down the technical road. I'm also doing some videos on how to do DaVinci Resolve. I'll do some recording videos. You'll even see I have a guitar lesson on here on Travis picking. And so if you find something you like, I'd love it if you share what I was doing. If you like this video, please click like, subscribe, consider subscribing. And as I mentioned in the video, if you want to get this code and ultimately grab a copy of a sheet with all this information so you can actually run it yourself and play around with it, then that is in the description of this video. There'll be a link and you can grab that if you use Google Workspaces or Gmail. That's all that technology is available to you. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch. Hope you found it valuable and interesting, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks.